this evening, and he's going to speak to us on signs of the times. So we look forward to listening to Brother Andy now as he speaks to us. Thank you, Andy.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm just going to share my screen. As you can imagine, I've got some things that I'd like to show you. So bear with me a minute. I'm just going to set this running properly so you can see everything that you need to see. Right, hopefully you can see a slide there that says signs of the times. Paul, can you see that okay?
Yeah, little bit off. So that's better. That's better. Now I can see it. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Yeah, there might be a little bit of a lag on this, but hopefully it will catch itself back up. So, well, look, good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be with you. It would have been, I guess, much nicer to be with you in person. I was thinking back when I was last at Solihull, and it was, I think it was June or July time, 2017, and I did a series of talks, Get Ready to See Jesus, I seem to remember, and it's almost 4 years after that, and we're still here. We're still waiting to see Jesus return, and clearly, with the way events are moving so fast at the minute, we're that much closer. So, what I wanted to do this evening is really have a think about really just what's happened so far this year. So, I'm not going to go back into last year. I've got some presentations on signs of the times for 2020, but it almost becomes out of date so quickly, doesn't it, with the pace of events. I wanted to just start talking just for a little minute about the pandemic. I'm pretty certain we're all pandemiced out, to be fair. You know, I'm sure we've heard lots and lots of talks about the pandemic. There's one particular aspect, just for a few minutes, I wanted to talk about in relation to that. And actually, really, it's not the pandemic itself. It's the fact that actually we're coming out, God willing, out of the pandemic. I say God willing because, of course, you know, it's been a time of testing for us as individuals, as ecclesias, and of course, as the world as a whole. It's been a period of immense testing. And we seem to be perhaps now, and we don't know for certain, but we appear to be on the brink of the world, perhaps with vaccines being able to come out of this sort of lockdown situation. Now, we don't, as I say, we don't know for certain what's around the corner. There could be more pandemics, and it could be that this current pandemic rumbles on, for a long, long time. We just don't really know. But it certainly looks at the minute as if, the vaccines might work, and it might be that the world restores itself back to normal to some extent. Maybe not what it once was, but at least life is getting back to normal. Let's say. Now, what is interesting about that, of course, is that, there's no shadow of a doubt in my mind, and maybe not in yours either, that God himself has brought this pandemic around at this point in time. It's not a coincidence that that a pandemic has struck at this point. It cannot be a coincidence that the whole world has been temporarily closed down, and we've had this time of testing. And it's almost as if perhaps now, as we're potentially coming out of this, that God is now looking to see what have we learned as a race of people on the planet, as families, as ecclesias, and as individuals. What have we learned from this experience that we've gone through? And, well, what I wanted to show you is what some of the headlines are saying might well happen when the world opens up. So this was I get the Times newspaper sent through to my phone every day. And this was just a couple of days ago on Monday. And this was the Times leading article that says, "View on new lockdown rules, eat, drink, and be merry." I mean, if you stop and think about it, during the last 12 months, just about every single form of human pleasure and entertainment has been closed down, hasn't it? I mean, it doesn't matter what you look at, any form of socializing's gone, shopping's gone. You can't go on foreign holidays anymore. It doesn't matter if you wanted to go to the cinema, if you wanted to eat at a pub or a restaurant, if you wanted to go to a nightclub, if you were a youngster, it doesn't matter. All forms of pleasure and human entertainment is being closed down. And now suddenly it looks like these things are going to start opening up. And the view of the Times is, well, let's eat, drink and be merry. And it's sort of, quite interesting that is their take on it. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with eating and drinking, and there's nothing wrong with being merry, but is the world's focus going to be entirely on these things of pleasure? Has mankind learned anything from the experience? Has it brought people back to God? Or is this now going to be almost like a release and everybody goes completely crazy? There's also obviously the economy is that the governments, as we know, are in enormous amounts of debt because of what's happened, having to fund many people's wages and so on over a 12-month period. But now all the bets are on a consumer boom to rival, as it says there, the roaring 20s. It's people who've got money to spend, so let's go and spend it. Let's have a great time. Let's enjoy ourselves. And, how are people going to react to all of this? And there's some absolutely horrifying pictures that I think we've probably all seen on the news where, people have gathered in parks and on beaches and left almighty mounds of rubbish. And this isn't just young, teenagers who, might be going a bit crazy. This is, old and young alike, just leaving mounds and mounds of rubbish. This is basically says to me when I look at this that, people are caring nothing for the planet on which they live. They care nothing other than having a good time and let somebody else clear up the mess. We are going to go crazy because we've been shut down. And, also, it isn't just what other people are doing as we come out of lockdown. I think we need to look at ourselves as well, and as individuals and as ecclesias, and how are we going to react as we come out of lockdown? Is our focus suddenly going to be on booking holidays and buying clothes and going to the shops and sort of, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with going on holiday or booking a holiday. I'm saying, is that now for encompassing all of our thinking? And God's looking at how we react as we come out to it, as he's looking at these people who clearly have got no respect whatsoever for him or the world in which he's made. The other thing that we see, or probably will see, according to quite a few headlines, is really the fear that there's going to be an eruption of violence on the streets after lockdown is lifted. There's many reports that are saying this, and in fact, they've already started to see gang violence increasing. So you think to yourself, well, are we going to see this sort of, lascivious behavior? Are we going to see people going over the top? I mean, in my work, in my business, it's a respectable business, and yet everybody at work is talking about getting drunk, going out and going crazy. And do you know the funny thing? Well, it's not funny, but the funny thing is that the people who are talking like that to me aren't in their 20s, they're in the 50s. And they're talking about getting drunk and going crazy and let's go to somewhere in Blackpool and have, 3 nights away and, go stupid. And I think, well, if 50-year-old sensible businessmen are saying this, what on earth are youngsters going to think? And this is maybe, what's around the corner. Now, I don't know about you, but in my mind, as I'm looking at all these sorts of headlines, these words of Jesus come to mind. Because in Luke 17, and we've read this so many times, but we've read about when Jesus is going to come back to the earth. And it says that it will be like as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. And isn't it interesting that Jesus lists out everyday things? So he says they did eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. And just as it was in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And you might well say, and rightly say, well, hold on a minute. People have always ate, they've always drank, they've always got married, they've always bought, they've always sold, they've always planted, and they've always builded. Right from beginning of creation. Why has Jesus given us these things specifically, do you think, to focus on? And maybe it's because when he comes back, this is the focus of the earth. And suddenly, as I've already shown you in the Times, you've got let's eat and drink and be merry. And you know, we've got all the headlines. Now we can buy, now we can sell, now we can shop, now we can build, now we can, and the world's focus is on exactly the things that Jesus has said here in this list. And maybe we've gone through this time of testing, and now we're into this phase of it, if you like, where God says, right, what have you done during this time of testing? What are you doing now? You've continued to turn your back on me. You're focusing on all these things. You've learned the grand total of nothing, and now time's up. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say in that regard. What I wanted to do now is have a think about some key things that have happened since the 1st of January this year that I think are really fascinating. And I'm going to start off just by talking about this. So, of course, on the 20th of January, the world had a new, well, say the world is the most powerful leader in the world. So from that point of view, it's a world impact. And of course, we saw the exit of Donald Trump, and in comes Joe Biden on the 20th of January. And, you know, we might, as Christadelphians looking at prophecy, have wondered why Trump didn't continue, because he was very, very pro-Israel. He moved the embassy. He did lots of positive things for Israel. And yet, despite everything that Trump could throw at it, he ends up out of office, and in comes Joe Biden. And I think we're going to see in a second the real significance of this happening. Because, as you remember, Trump said that there was no way he was going to attend the inauguration of Joe Biden, and didn't. And it's one of the only times in America's history where that's happened. And there's a huge amount of animosity, therefore, between these two presidents. And therefore, what Joe Biden is really trying to do is put a huge amount of clear blue water between himself and anything that President Trump stood for. And that is creating quite some serious reactions. Because if you think about it, if President Trump was pro something and very openly pro something, the chances are Biden will go to the extreme opposite. And we'll see that in a minute that he is. And it's to counteract President Trump. If President Trump had been a very mild-mannered, you know, pretty much straight down the line, just slightly left or right of center, then the next incoming president doesn't have to be as extreme. But almost to counteract President Trump's extremes is actually leading to Joe Biden to make more extreme statements, and I actually think he would have done otherwise. Interestingly, when Joe Biden stood up at his inauguration, and I'm not going to do the American accent because I can't, but he said, folks, it's a time of testing. That's what he said. It's a time of testing. Do you know what? He's right. This is a massive time of testing for the world right now. He wasn't maybe thinking in the concepts that we've been talking about so far in terms of the test, but it is a time of testing. And you know something? Some of the toughest questions are in relation to the Middle East when it comes to his presidency. You see, when you think about this Trump versus Biden situation, you've got Trump, who was actually, to some extent, in awe of powerful leaders. He was in awe of Putin, the North Korean leader, and so on. He actually sort of was on a sort of a similar par with them, and sort of, to some extent, envied their power. That's really what he wanted, was that level of power, of being able to just stay in power as an autocrat. And of course, democracy meant that he couldn't. But we know he was friendly with Putin and Russia, whatever influence Russia had on elections. We're not going to talk about that. But there was definite chemistry between Putin and Trump. And of course, there was also great hatred between Trump and Iran, because Trump wanted nothing to do with the Iranian agreement that Obama had put in place. And so what's happened since is that you've got Biden that's come in, and he wants to now massively stand up to Russia. He doesn't want to be friends with Putin. He wants nothing to do with him. He wants to show that he's very different to Trump. And in terms of Iran, well, of course, Biden, if you remember, was the vice president of Obama's presidency. And so Biden was actually instrumental in actually bringing around the original Iranian deal that Trump pulled out of. So now Biden says, well, I want to resurrect the deal. But as we're going to see, that is easier said than done. And there's a lot of things that are bubbling away there that's leading to trouble. This was the headline, the very first day, the first full working day of President Biden. This is a 22nd of January headline in the Financial Times. Biden faces first foreign policy test with Russian balancing act. Only its first full day in office, the Biden administration was facing its first big foreign policy test in the same place that hung over its predecessor for 4 years, and that is Russia, said the headlines. And this was because of Navalny, who was arrested, who, as we know, is trying to stand against Putin. So Putin had him poisoned, and then he had him arrested, and now he's in pretty much a concentration camp, it appears, 50 miles outside of Moscow. So this, on his first day, he's got a problem with Russia because Putin is acting against his opposition and arresting the opposition leader. Then we've got not only Russia testing President Biden. This is on the February the 17th. Iran tests Joe Biden with rocket attack on US coalition airbase in Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, you might say, well, why is Iran attacking a US base when Joe Biden's saying, hey, let's get the deal up and running again? And the reason is that Biden says, well, yeah, let's get this nuclear deal back on the road again. However, there's more conditions than we dreamt up 4 years ago that I want to put in place. And Iran says, no, we're not going to have any further consequences. In fact, stop all of your sanctions on us before we do anything. And so to sort of test Joe Biden, they fired rockets at a US base. On the 26th of February, there was this headline: Russia officials outraged at Joe Biden's Syrian strike as Iran remained silent. And the actual report said President Joe Biden approved airstrikes on Iranian-backed Iraqi militia fighters in Syria in retaliation for a militia rocket attack on American troops in Iraqi Kurdistan earlier this month. So now Joe Biden says, well, you've just fired rockets at me, Iran. I'm going to fight back at your militias in Syria. This in turn not only hits Iranian fighters, but Russia says, don't hit these people, whoever they might be, these Iranian-backed militias in Syria, stay out. So you can see the tension within literally 4 weeks of Biden coming into power has rocketed up. This was on the 7th of March, so it's literally only a few weeks ago. B-52s fly again over Middle East in US military warning to Iran. So now it's gone up another level because B-52 bombers are the #1 flying terror machine in America's army. I mean, they've been around for many years, but there's nothing bigger and, in America's opinion, nothing better than these monsters that can carry and do carry nuclear weapons. So they are a huge show of force out there. Now, what I want to, oh, by the way, if you read this article in The Independent, it said this: a pair of B-52 bombers flew over the Middle East on Sunday. The US military's Central Command said that the two B-52s flew over the region. Now listen to this: accompanied by military aircraft from nations including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. Now, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, obviously what you've got there, as we'll talk about in a minute, is some of the King of the South. And there they are, all joining forces with America. It's really significant in terms of the gathering of nations together in that particular report. What I'm going to do now is play you a little video clip. I'm hoping this works. It might be a little bit stuttery. We'll see how we get on. But I want you to have a listen to this, because this is some comments that Biden made on the 17th of March. So have a listen to this.
Well, tonight, echoes of the Cold War as a feud has erupted between the leaders of two nuclear superpowers. President Biden thinks Vladimir Putin is a killer, and the Russian president is responding. CBS's Ed O'Keefe reports now from the White House.
A dangerous war of words between the two presidents tonight. The Kremlin and Vladimir Putin hitting back at President Biden for calling him a killer.
So you know Vladimir Putin, you think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm. I do.
Responding today in Moscow, Putin said,
Кто как обзывается, тот так и называется.
It takes one to know one. Calling the relationship bad and under the threat of collapse, the Kremlin also pulled its ambassador back to Moscow for emergency meetings. The White House said the president has no regrets for his comment.
No, the president gave a direct answer to a direct question.
The administration is now considering new sanctions on the Kremlin as early as next week, after U.S. intelligence confirmed the Russians interfered in the 2020 election, hoping to swing the race to Donald Trump.
The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see shortly.
The president has also vowed to retaliate against Russia for their likely involvement in the SolarWinds computer hack, which breached several federal agencies and U.S. companies.
What is the holdup?
Some of the responses may be seen, some may be unseen, and of course the president reserves the right to respond in a manner and time of his choosing, as any president would. But he did make clear that the Russian government will pay a price.
Now, these are pretty extraordinary words, because you don't often get one world leader calling another world leader in open a killer. I mean, there's absolutely, nobody wants that. And Putin certainly doesn't want that. It undermines him back at home when this happens. And do you remember I said about Biden sort of reacting strongly, almost more than perhaps he would have done, because he's trying to counteract President Trump, who was friendly with Putin. He's gone to the absolute other extreme. But this is now causing reactions, because just literally weeks after that, Putin, surprise, surprise, starts reacting. And that's why we're starting to hear in the news at the minute about possible conflict in Ukraine. And many people link the huge buildup of troops over the last few weeks to Biden's attacks, personal attacks on Putin. So this was on the 9th of April. So this is just days ago, really. Ukraine fears attack as Putin masses tanks close to border. What's come out since then is that this isn't just a few tanks. Putin has put 80,000 troops right up against Ukraine's border. It's an enormous show of force. what America has done is now sent warships into the Black Sea to as a sort of a threat themselves against Putin. There will be consequences. This was whatever date that is, I can't remember, but it was a few days ago. There will be consequences. US warns Russia against aggression in Ukraine. Now, just have a listen to this that's coming up next. So this is the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, the most senior person in the US government, and have a listen to what he says about the situation growing into a nightmare scenario, potentially, in Ukraine.
More. And as we speak right now, I have to tell you, we have real concerns about Russia's actions on the borders of Ukraine. There are more Russian forces massed on those borders than at any time since 2014, when Russia first invaded. That's why we're in very close contact and close coordination with our allies and partners in Europe. All of us share that concern. And President Biden's been very clear about this. If Russia acts recklessly or aggressively, there will be costs, there will be consequences.
So what we've got is Biden making very personal attacks, if you like, against Putin. Putin then starts to react and begins to potentially stir up a whole bunch of trouble. Now, what has this got? What has all this got to do from a scriptural point of view? And I wonder if you've still got your Bibles open at Daniel 11. We can have a little look at this fascinating few verses that Paul read for us. I'll put them on the screen as well. So this is also in the authorized version, apart from the last verse, which I've used a more modern translation. Now, if you have a look at this, Daniel 11 verse 36 is talking about a man, it's talking about a king, it's talking about a ruler, doesn't actually say where he's from. And it says the king will do according to his will. He will exalt himself, magnify himself above every god. He will speak marvelous things against the God of gods. He's going to prosper. Whoever this king is, he's going to be very successful until the indignation is accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. This king isn't going to regard the God of his fathers or the desire of women or regard any God, because what he does is magnify himself above all. He sees himself better than any other person. But interestingly, it says in verse 38, in his estate, he will honor the God of forces. That's the word for munitions. It's the God of armies, basically. It's the God of war. It's the God of, as it says, the God of forces. And the God who his fathers knew not will he honor with gold, silver, and precious stones and pleasant things. And what that is basically saying in English is that whoever this ruler is, he is obsessed with these things. He's obsessed with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. He's interested in money and wealth and goods and nice things. In verse 39, it says that thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And this king shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for a gain. That last little verse isn't brilliantly translated. It's better translated in other translations as, this king will honor those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. That's the New Living Translation. Now, look, the point is this, that whoever this ruler is, right, whoever this king is, we've got 4 or 5 verses of description there about this man. So clearly God wants us to know who it is. It says in verse 40 that at the time of the end, the king of the south pushes at him. So whoever this king is, and I believe it's got to be a living, breathing human being, man, right? He must exist at the time of the end. This king isn't sort of symbolic of a huge nation, although the king himself clearly, because he's a king, a ruler, does rule over a nation. God says, I want to tell you about a specific individual human being. And if you look at the context of Daniel 11 and the previous verses, it's followed on from an individual description of an individual person that lived a long, long time ago that we haven't got time to look into. So the context here is that it's an individual person that we need to identify, and he absolutely exists at the time of the end. Now, 100 years ago is not the time of the end. 50 years ago is not the time of the end. The time of the end is the time of the end, and it's literally, let's say, a few years, maybe 5, 10, 20 years. I don't know the exact number of years that would constitute in God's mind the time of the end, but it's, you know, clearly, I think we all think we're at the time of the end now. Now, who is this king, and can we identify him? And the way that you can do it is this, because if you go back to Ezekiel 38, which we're not going to, put it on the screen, we've got these famous verses about somebody called Gog, who is a ruler of the land of Magog, who's chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And we know this is talking about Russia, and we know that Russia's going to come down with all these other armies and overflow into Israel. Now, if I put some colors on that screen there on Ezekiel 38, I've highlighted in different colors some key phrases, all right? Now, what I'm going to do is put up Daniel 11 on the right-hand side here. These are the exact verses that we've just read. And you can see, hopefully, how the colors sort of line up. So you've got in Ezekiel 38 and verse 8, it talks about all this happening in the latter years or the last days. And in Daniel 11, it talks about the time of the end. It talks about them coming from the north on the left, and on the right, it's talking about the king of the north. It talks about Ethiopia and Libya being amongst them, and it's got Libya and Ethiopia mentioned in Daniel 11. Clearly, as with all passages, they're not identical, right? Just as the Gospels aren't identical, there's extra information given on both sides. And when God says, put them together, we then get the clear picture. In verse 4 of Ezekiel 38, there's this army with horses and horsemen and armor. And then you've also, and chariots and so on. And then on Daniel 11, you've got chariots and horsemen and many ships. So I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that these two passages that we've just looked at in Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11 from verse 40 to 42 are exactly the same event. But here's the thing. What we've got in the first two verses of Ezekiel 38 is God talking to us about Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And Gog was originally the Scythian leader of the Scythians, because Magog, which is land which he comes from, is actually the land of the Magagites. And Josephus tells us that the Magagites is the same place as the Scythians, and the head of the Scythians was Gog, the head of the Magagites, which is all based in southern Russia, right? So look, on the left in Ezekiel 38, we've got a man called Gog, who is ruling over Russia, but we're not told any more really about him, apart from that there's this great army that comes down and attacks Israel. What I'm going to suggest to you is that Gog himself is the king that is being described in verses 36 to 39 of Daniel chapter 11. You see how all of this lines up? We're given his sort of biblical name of Gog in Ezekiel 38. Daniel 11 doesn't tell us what his name is, but it says, I'll tell you all about him, and I'll give you a huge amount of detail. So I'm saying to you that the current ruler of Russia, the current Gog of the land of Magog, the current chief prince of Meshech and Tubal is Vladimir Putin. And I'm going to suggest to you that Vladimir Putin himself is the king that exists at the time of the end, that is described in amazing detail for us in verses 36 to 39 of Daniel chapter 11. And I've done a series of talks on this that goes through each of these statements, and every last one of them lines up perfectly with this king, with this man, with this ruler of Russia, and no other world leader does. But I just want to show you one thing that I found interesting. So if you look at that final statement about this man, this king who does according to his will, who magnifies himself in his heart, who honors the God of armies and forces and prospers in everything that he does and so on. The last thing we're told about him before something happens is that he honors those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority, and divides the land among them as their reward. That's what the NLT version says. So if we were to decode this, this would say the Russian ruler, who is currently Putin, is going to honor those who submit to him. He's going to appoint them to positions of authority, and he's going to divide the land among them as their reward. Now, not that long ago, you could have switched on your TV and watched Panorama, right? And we're going to watch Panorama right now for 2 minutes and have a listen to what Panorama said about this man.
He's the world leader accused of personally approving murder on the streets of London.
The conclusion that the Russian state was probably involved in the murder of Mr. Litvinenko is deeply disturbing.
But is the president implicated in an assassination also responsible for theft on an extraordinary scale?
He has fleets of things that almost no billionaire in the West would have.
Vladimir Putin has been accused of looting his own country.
Today, Putin behaves like a czar.
Tonight, we investigate the truth about President Putin's riches.
Why would it be kept secret?
Because it belongs personally to Putin, not to the state.
And for the first time, the Americans say what they really think about the Russian president.
Is Vladimir Putin corrupt?
In our view, yes.
The men closest to Putin have been with him for years. They were with him here in St. Petersburg, and they've stayed with him ever since. And this is the group that he trusts and that he rewards. And this is the group that runs Russia.
Putin's lawyer at the town hall became president and then prime minister of Russia. His former deputy also served as prime minister. The chief of staff at the town hall now runs Russia's anti-drugs agency. His former assistant now runs the biggest oil company in the world. And his former economist now runs the biggest gas company in the world. For those who've been in Putin's circle, the benefits have been immense. A cellist who is godfather to Putin's daughter has a valuable stake in a major Russian bank. A neighbor has an even bigger stake. Another neighbor ended up running the railways. A childhood friend has made a fortune from government contracts. And his brother has made even more. The Americans say this is how Putin's Russia works.
Well, that's pretty incredible, isn't it, don't you think? What did it say? He will honor those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority, and divides the land among them as their reward. It's almost identical language in Panorama. It's incredible. And look what happens at the time of the end. The king of the south pushes at this man. Now, the question, therefore, is we've identified who the man is, who the ruler is, who the king is. It's Gog himself, Putin. And at the time of the end, the king of the south pushes at him. So the question is, who is the king of the south? And if we had time, we could prove that the king of the south, from Ezekiel 38, the parallel passage, is Britain, America, and Saudi Arabia. Mainly, those are the true kings of the south: Britain, America, and Saudi Arabia. And America and Britain, as we know, have got lots and lots of bases in Saudi Arabia and lots of force. So when the Bible talks about the king of the south, it's talking about America, Britain, and Saudi Arabia. So now what we're being told is that it's America and Britain and Saudi Arabia that are going to push at an individual person. They're going to push at him. They're going to push at Putin. Now, the word push, by the way, in your Bible, where have a look in verse 40, where it says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. If you've got a modern translation, it won't say push, it will say attack. Now, the actual word for push is the Hebrew word for gore, as in a bull with a horn goring somebody. And that's exactly what that word push is. It's the word to gore. It isn't very often, as I'm sure you're aware, a bull will not kill somebody with its horn. It will cause us some damage, but it doesn't actually finish them off entirely. And so I think the idea here is that it's a military provocation. I think that's the best way I would interpret that word push. So at the time of the end, there's this sort of a provocation, and it's a painful provocation, and it's not one that the king that we read about in verse 36 to 39 likes one iota. In fact, if you're putting it on the screen as actual pictures, you know, there's a bull with a horn that's goring that man, that's pushing the man with its horn. And so there's Gog, if you like, as a man. And there's the king of the south, you know, causing this aggravation, that's causing real pain and aggravation. Doesn't finish him off, but it's this provocation. And then if you look what happens next, well, what happens next is the king of the north comes against the king of the south like a whirlwind. And what happens is that this ruler that's being provoked then comes down as a nation, because when it talks about the king of the north, then it's talking not about an individual person, it's now talking about a nation. Just as the king of the south is a reference to a nation and a group of nations, where you read the king of the north, it's a bit like the king who's mentioned in those earlier verses now summons all his force together, and he becomes this mighty king of the north power that sweeps down. And in fact, of course, that's what we see happen in Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11, because after we're told about Gog in Ezekiel 38, what do we read? We read that God puts hooks in his jaws and pulls him down. In fact, what you've really got is a pull in Ezekiel 38, because God pulls him down. And in Daniel 11, you've got a push. There's a pull and there's a push. The pull is the lust of the wealth of oil in Israel, and the push is the provocation of the king of the south against the king himself, the ruler of Russia. So there's a push and a pull that's involved in this. And surely, you know, we're seeing Biden really provoking massively Putin at this time, and Putin is starting to react by sending troops around the place. How are we doing for time? Not very well. I was just going to finish off by talking a little bit about something else that's on the cards at the moment, and that is Israel versus Iran. Because at the same time tensions building between America and Russia, which we expected, tension is rocketing up between Israel and Iran. Now, this is happening because Israel is very anti-Biden making any new deal with Iran. And therefore, Israel is starting to poke at Iran, and Iran is starting to poke back at Israel. And there's lots happening here. So I'm just going to show you a few headlines before I throw a few Bible passages at you. So this is the 13th of January, just before Biden comes into power. Intense Israeli airstrikes hit in East Syria. The region is on high alert. And the article actually says that they were targeting Iranian-backed forces in Syria. On the 3rd of February, we had these reports coming out from the Middle East. Israel discussing possible attack on Iran. So on the 3rd of Feb, it said Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday met with senior security and army officials to discuss preparations for a possible attack on Iran, local media outlets reported. On the 16th of February, Israeli Air Force simulates strikes on 3,000 Hezbollah targets a day in a widespread drill. Because one of the things that Israel believes and is right about is that when the conflict actually begins between Israel and Iran once the conflict, the nearby surrounding conflict begins, Hezbollah is definitely going to be involved in that. So they're testing themselves against possible Hezbollah attacks. This was on the 27th of Feb, and this is a series of things going on right now. Explosion strikes Israeli-owned ship in the Middle East amid tension. And this was blamed on Iran. So an Israeli ship in the Middle East is attacked, and Iran was to blame. On the 8th of March, this was the headline in Newsweek, Iran will raise Tel Aviv if Israel attacks, Defense Minister warns amid nuclear standoff. Iran's defense minister has responded to the suggestion of military action from Israel by threatening to raise the cities of Tel Aviv and Haifa as regional tensions remain high amid US President Joe Biden's efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal. Then on the 12th of March, Iran reports attack on its cargo vessel in the Middle East. So we had an Israeli ship attacked, and now we've got an Israeli ship attacked, and now it's an Iranian ship being attacked a few days later. And again, Iran blamed Israel for that. On the 26th of March, an Israeli ship sailing to India is hit by an Iranian missile in the Arabian Sea. And this was fired by an Iranian missile by one of the Revolutionary Guards. Then on the 9th of April, just a few days ago, Israeli special forces used a sticky bomb to attack a huge Iranian ship. And this ship wasn't just a cargo ship, although it pretended to be a cargo ship. It was actually known as the mothership for Iran, that was going backwards and forwards, taking all sorts of armaments and missiles and rockets backwards and forwards to Iranian proxy militias in the Middle East. And Israeli special forces are believed to have attacked the ship using sticky bombs and pretty much blew it up. Then on the 12th of April, this is just a few days ago, the Iranian nuclear plant was hit by a Mossad cyber attack. And this has caused immense damage to Iran. It's probably put their nuclear weapon program back, they reckon, by about 9 months. But it was Israel that did that. In fact, the very same building was hit late last year, with fire. A huge devastating fire was caused, and they reckon that was Israel behind that as well. This time they've used a cyber attack to it wasn't just computers that got impacted, it actually caused quite a lot of actual physical destruction of the place as well. In the meantime, Iran has threatened revenge for this attack. Yesterday they've threatened revenge on Israel, and Israel says, fine, do your worst. Israel actually admitted to this. It's one of the very few times that Israel has ever admitted to anything that it's done, but it actually did admit that it was behind this cyber attack on Iran. And so just for the last 5 minutes, I just wanted to cover off, because we're not going to look at all these passages, but you might wonder, where does Iran fit into all of this? Well, we know Iran is there in Ezekiel 38 because Persia is mentioned as joining forces with Russia when Russia descends into Israel. But I put it to you that actually Iran is involved before Russia comes down. And in fact, what happens before Russia descends into Israel is that there is an inner ring war around Israel, that Iran is absolutely the power behind the scenes that it makes that happen. And that inner ring war that comes around Israel is all of the surrounding peoples around Israel are going to launch attacks on Israel, which Israel is going to win. When Israel has won that war, and by the way, Israel is going to be quite weakened after that war, but victorious, it's into that void when Israel is believing that peace is now on the cards and we've now overcome all of our pricking briars and we've won against Hezbollah and Hamas and the Palestinians once and for all. It's into that so-called peaceful void that Russia and Iran that survived all of that comes in and attacks. I'll just have a quick look in the last few minutes, if you would, at Isaiah chapter 21. It might not be a passage that you've looked at much before because it's not often quoted in any of the books that I've read over my time. It might be somewhere, but it's not one that I've really come across in prophecy books. But in Isaiah 21, it talks here about the burden of the desert of the sea. As whirlwinds in the south pass through, so it comes from the desert, from a terrible land. A grievous vision is declared unto me. The treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously, and the spoiler spoileth. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media, all the sighing thereof I have made to cease. Therefore, says Isaiah, who is seeing all of these things, he says, my loins are filled with pain. Pangs have taken hold upon me, as pangs of a woman that travaileth. I was bowed down at the hearing of it. I was dismayed at the seeing of it. My heart panted. Fearfulness affrighted me. The night of my pleasure has turned into fear unto me. So something's going on here that Isaiah sees that frightens him almost to death. And he says it's all to do, this grievous vision, with a treacherous deal, right? There's a treacherous deal that's done. And by the way, the context of this chapter is all last days, because there's a series of burdens that all of them are to do with latter day burdens on the earth. And this is a big one. And he says, look, he says there's a treacherous deal. And the treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously. And the whole talk at the minute is about Iran's deal, right? And that it's treacherous. That's exactly what Israel is saying. It's a treacherous deal. Now, how do we know this has got anything whatsoever to do with this Iranian treacherous deal that's on the cards at the minute? Well, in verse 2, you notice that after he talks about the treacherous deal, it says, go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media. So I'm going to put on the screen here where those places are. And there is Elam, as you can see on the screen there. And Media is just above the name Iran. I've put the name Iran on there and the name Saudi Arabia, just so you can see where the nations are modern day. But Elam is southwest Iran. And Media is pretty much the rest of Iran in ancient times. So what you've got here is a treacherous deal that's involving the nation of Iran. And in fact, of course, the very first bit talks about the burden of the desert of the sea. And the sea that it's talking about is the Persian Gulf, because Elam backed up against the Persian Gulf, right? And on both sides of the Persian Gulf, even today, it's mainly desert. This is the desert of the sea. And there's a treacherous deal, and something happens that causes Elam and Media to besiege. Now, interestingly, 20% of the world's oil supply goes through the Persian Gulf, right past Elam, straight through the Persian Gulf and out. And guess what Iran has threatened to do if anybody pushes them too far? They have threatened to besiege the Persian Gulf and stop oil flowing through to disrupt the economies of the world. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And so something is going to happen in this area, and it's not going to be pleasant, because it made Isaiah, when he saw what happened, so fearful. Paul, have I got 3 or 4 minutes just to wrap this up? Because I've probably got 3 or 4 minutes, or do you want to wrap up in less than that? You're muted, by the way.
Sorry, I'm on mute. As quick as you can, Andy. Yeah.
All right. As quick as I can, have a look at Psalm 83. So Psalm 83, I'm sure you're all aware of Psalm 83. It's a very interesting psalm that is talking about the enemies that surround Israel, making a tumult and basically wanting to destroy Israel. And if you have a look in verse 2 of Psalm 83, it says, "For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people." Verse 4 says, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." They've consulted together and all the rest of it. And then what it does, it gives you a list of people that are all against Israel: Edom, Moab, Gebal, Ammon, Amalek, Philistines, inhabitants of Tyre. And verse 8 says that Asher is also joined with them. And if I put all of those nations on the map, then every last one of those nations, first of all, none of them are mentioned in Ezekiel 38, not one, but they're all mentioned here as ganging up on Israel, and every last one of them surround Israel and are close by to Israel. This is the inner ring war that I was telling you about. And when it says Asher in verse 8, that's normally translated Assyria. And when Psalm 83 was written, and there's a bit of debate as to when it was written, Assyria covered modern day Iran, modern day Iraq, and modern day Syria. All right, that's the extent that Assyria covered at the time when Psalm 83 was written. And so what we're being told is there's an inner ring war against Israel, but there's a power that backs them. There's a power that is looking after them and supporting them, and that power is Assyria. And I think that is code for Iran, Iraq, and Syria itself, all of which support these peoples that live round and about Israel. Hezbollah, for instance, are based in Tyre. The Palestinians obviously are based in Philistia, and so on and so forth. So these are the nations that are going to gang up. So look, we know we're at the time of the end. I'm absolutely convinced we are. I'm sure you're convinced we are. In just a few months this year, we've seen some incredible signs. The Bible said that Russia is going to have an alliance with Iran. It says that in Ezekiel 38. And on April the 10th, what did we read in the press? But Russia and Iran sign a military cooperation agreement. It's exactly what Ezekiel 38 said we would see. And at the same time, just a couple of weeks before, Israel in talks to establish a 4-nation defense alliance with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. It's exactly the alliance that we read about as the King of the South in Ezekiel chapter 38. Hopefully that's been of some interest. Lots going on. Who knows when Christ is going to come back, but surely, you know, the road ahead of us might be much, much shorter than perhaps we think. But thank you for listening, and I'm sorry that it's gone on a little bit longer than intended. I will stop sharing my screen at that point.